imperial masters. But more destructive than any of these frontier revolts was an uprising that I have only mentioned in passing thus far that deserves far more attention. For the shocking violence that defined it, yes, but also for the reactionary attitude it couldn't have helped but imprint on the new emperor. A reactionary attitude that would come back to haunt Hadrian later in his reign. I am talking, of course, about the Second Jewish War. I mentioned the revolt in passing while talking about Trajan's troubled supply lines during the last phase of his Middle Eastern campaign, but really, issues with Trajan's supply lines is the real passing issue. The revolt itself is the thing, and as it engulfed the southwest Mediterranean, the loss of life was shocking, even by ancient standards. After the Flavians methodically conquered Judea during the First Jewish War, many of the Jews who were not killed or sold into slavery fled their decimated homeland for greener pastures elsewhere in the empire. But their refusal to forsake their traditions and assimilate into the local Greco-Roman societies they arrived in led to fear, anger, and resentment on both sides. Locals couldn't understand why the Jews were being so stubborn and tried to force them to change their ways, while the newly arrived Jews felt nothing but hostility and oppression from their new neighbors. In 115, a man named Lucullus, a Jewish leader from Cyrene, the province neighboring Egypt to the west, finally decided he had had enough, announced that as the new king of the Jews, he was declaring war on his Hellenized neighbors. Though there is a great deal of anti-Semitic hyperbole in the ancient histories, it seems clear that Lucullus led the Jews of Cyrene on a campaign of cultural cleansing. Greek and Roman temples were destroyed, civic buildings were sacked, and all non-Jewish inhabitants, military and civilian alike, were killed on sight. The revolt soon spread to the neighboring province of Egypt, north to the island of Cyprus, and eventually into the newly conquered Mesopotamia, where local Jews attacked Trajan's rearguard garrisons. At the height of the anarchy, Lucullus was able to seize control of Alexandria, and the city was partially burned to the ground. North, on the closed island of Cyprus, reports have it that upwards of 200,000 Greco-Roman residents were slaughtered by the Jews. At first, Trajan was sure his local governors would be able to deal with the problem without the need for further imperial support. But after the prefect of Egypt withdrew from Alexandria, Trajan became convinced that this was a much bigger deal than he wanted it to be. He dispatched a trusty lieutenant named Marcus Turbo with enough troops to retake Alexandria and ordered a full legion onto the usually unoccupied island of Cyprus to put down the marauding Jews. While Cyprus was easily repacified, the fighting in Egypt was much tougher, and Turbo was only able to declare victory in late 117, after Trajan was dead. Lucullus and what was left of his army fled to the Judean city of Lydda, where they were besieged by the commander of Trajan's eastern invasion force, Lucius Quietus. Eventually, this last stronghold fell as a result of famine and disease, and Lucullus, the other Jewish commanders, and an untold number of civilians were executed by the Romans. For his success, Quietus was summarily dismissed as too great a threat to Hadrian's new, and thus far still shaky, hold on power. That this Second Jewish War was still ongoing as they played mightily into the new emperor's decision to abandon the East and consolidate Roman control over what was already theirs. Of course, in Hadrian's mind, this included Judea, Jewish uprising or no Jewish uprising, and after the revolt was over, a legion was moved back into the province to ensure its true pacification. Hadrian may have already been formulating his long-term and ill-fated plan for what to do about the troublesome Jewish province, but for now, it was enough that the violence was stopped. As for Cyrene, where the revolt began, the ancient sources report that the province was so depopulated that Hadrian was forced to actively engage in a recolonization project later in his reign. The island of Cyprus simply banned outright any further Jewish settlement. With the endgame of the Jewish revolt serving as a backdrop, and remember that Hadrian was living in Antioch at the time, just up the road, Hadrian made his fateful decision to pull out of the east and allow the Parthian king Trajan had deposed to return to the throne. There is a lot of talk about how much the withdrawal struck at the heart of the Roman notion that their empire would expand forever, but I think much closer to their hearts was the worship of an obscure god named Terminus, who was the patron of boundaries, and who, it was said, Jupiter himself could not move. Deep in the center of the Roman identity was not simply the notion that they would expand forever, but that what was taken once could never be lost. Once Terminus had set a new boundary, Jupiter himself could not move it. And yet here was Hadrian, a mere mortal, retreating from Terminus's new line, moving him backwards. I think this is really what offended the Senate, who were mightily offended by Hadrian's decision. But Hadrian, as I said, would stand firm, and the eastern pullout was just the opening shot in his war on future military adventurism. In October of 117, Hadrian decided that things in the east were settled enough that he could begin the journey back to Rome. He marched up along the Danube and inspected the imperial defenses, appointing a new governor of Lower Moesia named Avidius Nigrinus, and took another shot at Terminus by ordering the legions to withdraw from the territory they had seized on the far side of the Danube. Like with Mesopotamia, Hadrian determined the land was too difficult to hold for too little benefit, and as with Mesopotamia, the decision was met with ridicule in the Senate. Hadrian was digging himself into quite a political hole, and he would need to do some serious damage control when he returned to Rome. But before he made it back to Italy, that political hole would become something of a bottomless pit, either through Hadrian's own misguided paranoia, or because of the misguided paranoia of a few overzealous allies. Or maybe it wasn't misguided at all. Maybe it was all totally justified. Whatever it was, and whoever was behind it, the political murders of 4 ex-consuls in early 118 would be a black mark that Hadrian would spend the rest of his life trying to spin, justify, deny, ignore, and just plain forget. The affair was eventually laid at the feet of Hadrian's old guardian and the current Praetorian prefect Attianus, who, as I mentioned last week, was from the word go, urging Hadrian to engage in some kind of purge. Attianus supposedly uncovered information that the 4 high-ranking senators were engaged in a plot to murder or overthrow Hadrian, and either at Hadrian's direct order or on his own initiative had the men seized and executed without trial. The first 2 victims were Cornelius Palma, former governor of Syria, and Publius Celsus, who had already been kicked out of Trajan's inner circle for suspicion of treason. Both of these men Attianus had already advised Hadrian to kill, though the first time around, as I said last week, Hadrian advised less drastic measures. The second 2 victims, though, seemed to come out of nowhere, and their deaths shocked the Roman elite, who became convinced that regardless of Hadrian's stated desire to leave the Senate in peace, that they were dealing with a megalomaniacal psychopathic egotist. In other words, nothing less than the second coming of Domitian. The continuity is confused about who did what to who when, but at the end of the day, Lucius Quietus, on his way home to Mauritania, and Avidius Nigrinus, the recently appointed but quickly dismissed governor of Lower Moesia, were both dead. Even more offensive than the murders themselves was the fact that Hadrian, or at the very least Attianus, had compelled the Senate to act as an accomplice. Just as had been Domitian's practice, the Senate was forced to sign the death warrants themselves, officially confirming that the threat against the new emperor was real and the executions justified. No one in the Senate believed a word of the trumped-up charges, and the murderous coercion enraged them to a man. When Hadrian finally arrived in Rome in July of 118, he was greeted by a more or less joyful citizen body, but was scorned by a super-duper pissed-off Senate. Hadrian's wisdom, though, was not limited to law and justice and the arts and all the other things he is remembered for. It also included that keen sense of self-awareness that is an oft-overlooked quality of really effective leaders. In essence, Hadrian knew that he had stepped in it big time, and that he needed to do everything in his power to repair the damage the murders had caused. The ambitious new emperor had an impressive list of things he wanted to accomplish during his years in power, and he knew nothing was going to get done if he was forever undercut by a sulking Senate. Or, perhaps more likely, he was afraid that they would finally put together a real conspiracy and kill him outright. It had happened before. So Hadrian went out of his way to make amends. He pleaded innocence in the affair and claimed his subordinates had acted without his knowledge. He removed Attianus as prefect and swore up and down that he would prove good to his word that the Senate would remain sacrosanct. In the weeks that followed, he made sure to make himself seen publicly and invited anyone who so desired to come visit him at the imperial palace. If they believed he would prove to be a reclusive, autocratic Domitian, then he would show them with his actions that he was an available, genial Augustus. In all his words and deeds, Hadrian sought to continue the Principate and studiously avoided anything that would remind anyone of Domitian. In a final nod to the disaffected Senate, he declared that henceforth, any proceeds from legal penalties, fines and confiscations and such, would go directly to the state treasury, not the imperial accounts. Hadrian hoped everyone would understand that under his regime, the fundraising possibilities of proscriptions and treason trials, that old imperial boogeyman, would be null and void. Though for a variety of reasons he would never fully win over the Senate, in time, they at least came to believe that another reign of terror was no longer right around the corner. He may have been a lot of things, some good and some bad, but he was not another Domitian. With the Senate attended to as best as they could be, after all, time was the only salve that would truly heal their wounds, Hadrian moved on to securing the support of the people at large. He wanted to make a big splash, both to celebrate his ascension, but also to get the masses fully behind him so he could leverage his popularity with them against the suspicious Senate. A big splash, then, may actually be a bit of an understatement, and I have to believe that most citizens thought it some kind of joke when they heard that the emperor planned to cancel all outstanding debts on any state loan taken out in the past 15 years. But it was no joke, and to prove his point, he had the Praetorians march the loan records out into Trajan's Forum and burn them all in a great pyre. A coin commemorates the event that, made Hadrian an instant hit with the people. He then announced that he intended to revise and extend the alimentary system begun by Nerva and perpetuated by Trajan, and further, the number of financial burdens that had previously been borne by the local municipalities would now be funded directly from the imperial treasury. Finally, Hadrian gave the people what they really wanted: games, games, and more games. Gladiatorial shows and chariot races were a given, but Hadrian's early games, especially the one celebrating his 43rd birthday in January 119, marked Hadrian as an unequaled patron of wild animal hunts in the arena. The emperor, somewhat in the face of aristocratic good taste, was an avid hunter, and did his best to bring the thrill of felling a great beast to his subjects, who ate up all his bread and circuses with relish. With any dissent in Italy more or less pacified, and his regime now fully legitimized, Hadrian turned his attention to the provinces. But unlike previous emperors, who were content to rule the empire by way of correspondence, Hadrian believed that the only way he could make a proper decision about anything was to be there for himself. Unlike Trajan, who was disposed to let his subordinates figure it out for themselves, Hadrian was a micromanager of the highest order, who had no intention of letting any decision of import pass his desk without comment. If you combine the need to micromanage with an active personality determined to assess all situations for himself, what you get is an emperor who has no intention of lounging around Rome all day. What you get is an emperor who will spend more time on the road and visit more provinces than any other emperor before or since. By my calculations, Hadrian spent roughly half of his 21-year reign on one of his extended tours of the empire, and even when he was home in Italy, he resided at his villa